Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Musical Innertube. I am Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. You know, Don's had quite a career in radio and television, where he's been an air personality, a news anchor, even a TV weatherman.
And John's been a college professor. He's written several books, and he's been an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
We first teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives.
Our guest today at the Musical Innertube is Nicole Weisensee Egan, who we will henceforward address as Nikki. She is an author, a former reporter for the Philadelphia Daily News, and a former editor at People magazine. Her books include the 2019 bestseller Chasing Cosby, the best account I've read of the twisty-turny story of Bill Cosby, formerly America's dad. Welcome to the Musical Innertube, Nikki.
Thanks for having me on.
Talk about how the events of the last few months with Bill Cosby and he becoming sort of a commentator on the trial of R. Kelly. How does that strike you? Because it's so bizarre to me.
So, yeah, I said I wish I could say I was surprised by Andrew Wyatt's comments, but, you know, after watching him for many, many years and dealing with him, I'm not surprised by much. I've seen some things on Twitter where Cosby's Twitter site, which, of course, Andrew Wyatt maintains, is like, he wasn't speaking for Bill Cosby when he said that. You know, whatever. But I mean, that's his theme and that's his shtick, and he's going to stick to it because they also claim Cosby was railroaded. So it's just, you know, at one point, Andrew Wyatt was offering his PR services for free to R. Kelly a couple years ago. I don't know if Cosby was actually going to pay for it. So he certainly thinks that they have something in common in that they were both falsely convicted. And I don't know about R. Kelly's case, but I would say that's absolutely not the case with Bill Cosby.
Let's talk about what actually did set Cosby free. That was, to me, it seems like a technicality. Is that right?
It's not only a technicality, it didn't follow the actual law of Pennsylvania. It was a very bizarre decision that just reeked of special treatment because, first of all, these appeals courts are not finders of fact, and the PA Supreme Court was supposed to abide by the lower court's ruling about the credibility of on this issue. Like Bruce Castor, there was a hearing he testified for several hours in February 2016 on this very issue, and so did one of Cosby's attorneys about this alleged immunity agreement, quote unquote, which, by the way, was actually a press release from 2005, and the judge found them both not credible. So the Supreme Court is not supposed to rule on that because, of course, they're not in court. They're not listening to these people testify. They're not there. They have no way to determine credibility without actually physically being there. So they overstepped with that, in my view. And what I think is also interesting is there were two issues they were looking at. One, whether this immunity agreement, quote unquote, and I really put that in quotes because it was a press release and one I got in 2005. And there was never any suggestion it was anything but that until it became clear that Cosby was going to be arrested. And then all of a sudden, Bruce Castor started saying that press release was an immunity agreement. So that's the one issue. And the second one was...
If I may interrupt, Nikki, we should identify Bruce Castor and his role in this, if you would, please.
Sure. Sorry. Bruce Castor was the Montgomery County District Attorney in January 2005 when Andrea Constand first went to police and said that Bill Cosby had drugged and sexually assaulted her at his Chelton Township mansion the year before in January 2004. And Bruce mysteriously just kind of pulled the plug on the investigation less than a month later while his own detectives were still investigating it. And even though there were about a dozen other women who came forward who said Cosby did the same thing to them. And he just pulled the plug on the investigation, surprising his own detectives, and put this press release out he even testified. It was unusual. He wrote it and he's the one who faxed it. And he really didn't know how to use a fax machine. He had to learn. So there were There were a number of things that were unusual about it. He also did not notify Andrea's attorneys, or Andrea herself was not notified that he made this decision. The attorneys found out when reporters showed up on their doorstep. So there was a lot that was unusual about it, but there was never any suggestion that it was an immunity agreement. So that was the one issue. And the other was that the judge in the second trial allowed 5 other women, so-called 404B witnesses, to testify about what they say Cosby did to them. And they're witnesses who are allowed because of to show a pattern of behavior. He's not charged with them. They're just witnesses to support the main witness's claims. Right. And they didn't even get to that issue. And that was the issue I thought that they would want to address, because the one thing the judge struggled with during these pretrial hearings was how many of these witnesses are you allowed to testify, and how far back can these claims go? And there was just no guidance in the laws about that. So I thought that might be something they'd address, but instead, because this other one was just ridiculous. I'm like, this immunity agreement was, this press release was an immunity agreement. And also in Pennsylvania, and this was testimony too during that trial, an immunity agreement has to be put in writing and it has to be signed off on by a judge. Neither of these things happened. But that's when Bruce Castor was testifying, that because he was the sovereign of Montgomery County, he didn't have to do this. He could just make a press release. It's like, voila, this press release is now an immunity agreement. It was some incredible magicism, but it was not anything legal. So that was really odd that the Supreme Court bought that argument. But I had watched the oral arguments, because if you watch them on YouTube, and they're still there. In fact, Cosby has it pinned on his Twitter site. So that tells you how much he likes that decision. And the justices were very hostile to the prosecution. At one point, the Chief Justice asked Adrian Jaffe a question and then just walked off camera for 10 minutes. And all you saw was his name while she was answering his question. And then he came and sat back down and didn't say a word about where he'd been or why he'd gone or why he asked her a question, and didn't even bother to stick around for the answer. So I really, when I watched that, I was like, wow, they're going to rule against him. But the thing is, the normal remedy is, okay, you're not allowing this deposition testimony because that was partially an issue that Cosby had supposedly been so forthcoming in this deposition in the Andrea's civil suit because he had been told he would never be prosecuted.
We should mention also that Andrea Constant was the main plaintiff. Is that right? She
was the one who went to police in January 2005 and said that Cosby had drugged and sexually assaulted her. So even if, the judge rules again, the justices decide to throw out the conviction, the normal remedy is for another trial. And you just don't allow in that evidence that they felt was not let in correctly. But they didn't do that. They just said he can't be tried a third time, and he basically got a get out of jail card immediately. I mean, there were so many things that were extraordinary about this decision, because let me tell you, I've done stories on wrongfully convicted people. I'm keeping in touch with one who has maintained his innocence for 20 years. He's still sitting in prison, even though the Philly DA's office has pretty much determined he's innocent. It's a process to then untangle that and then get released, but not if you're Bill Cosby. Now, the DA's office can appeal, and they had 3 months, but I just found out that they got a 2-month extension because of COVID. So they now have until November 29th to file an appeal. It seems like they haven't said if they're going to appeal, but reading between the lines in a story the New York Times did a couple months ago, last month, it almost looks like, if anything, they may address that part of it, the barring the third trial issue, because you could appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's a very narrow issue it's got to be on. There's all these requirements. And of course, the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't hear 99% of the cases that ask to be heard by them. And if you send it back to the PA Supreme Court to look at it again, what's the point of that? I mean, they're the ones who ruled here.
Who made the ruling anyway.
But then Justice Barrett did this crazy interview where he got all the facts of the case wrong too. He did a TV interview. So it's just, stay tuned. It's not over. I really don't think it's over.
I know that Bill Cosby, there's more than 60 women who have at one time or another said that he sexually assaulted them in one way or another. Can he not be tried for any of those, or is this just the Andrea Constant part he can't be tried for again?
There's none that out there that we know of that are within the statute of limitations. And in fact, when the DA... By the way, the DA that reopened Andrea's case in 2015 was Risa Furman. Okay, right. She was Bruce Castor's first assistant in 2005 when the case first landed with them. And she reopened the case in 2015. Now, would she have reopened the case if there was this immunity agreement? In fact, Castor even tried to say, don't you remember, Risa, when we had this immunity agreement? And she's writing, because all these emails became evidence. She's like, Bruce, refresh my memory. What are you talking about? And she said, well, where's the paperwork? I know you, Bruce, you're a meticulous record keeper. Where's the paperwork? Where is this immunity agreement? And did a judge sign off on it? And of course, no, because, he's the sovereign. But yeah, so Risa is the one who reopened this. And she would not have reopened a case like this if there was any sort of agreement like this in place. And these agreements have to be in writing and signed off on by a judge for the very reason of what just happened here, which is if you get these backroom deals that free someone, this prosecutor says, don't worry, I'll never prosecute you. I mean, it's utterly unfair. And this is how people like Bill Cosby go free for years because of these secret deals, that I think law enforcement protected him for many, many years.
So you had a situation where the issue was brought up in 2005, shortly after Andrea Costin decided to pursue it, and then it was dropped. And then, as you said, the successor to Bruce Castor, the next DA, brings it up again. Was it solely because of that comic, Hannibal Buress, throwing out the rape thing in his stand-up act? Was that the turning point that got it dug back up and back on the docket?
Yeah, well, sort of. I mean, that's not why Risa reopened it, but it set off a chain of events that led to that because that video went viral. That Hannibal Buress did a routine in Philly in October 2014, and in it he had just been doing this one on and off for 6 months, and no reaction anywhere until it was in Philly. And he talked about, if you don't believe it, Google it. And Dan McQuaid, who was a reporter for Philly Mag, happened to be in the audience. He hears Bill Cosby and his ears perk up and he takes his iPhone out and just starts filming it because he knows Cosby's always had this history with young Black comics, telling them not to swear and having issues with them and everything. So we thought it might be a good item. So he posted it the next day. Nothing really happened over the weekend, but then by Monday, Gawker picked it up. All these places went and it just exploded and went viral. And that was the big difference because I'm sitting there watching it and all the same women that I had interviewed in 2005, because I'd interviewed a number of accusers, there were 14 total, started coming forward again. And I'm sitting there going, this is like deja vu all over again. I reported all of this in 2005 and nobody cared. And in fact, I was criticized. I was lambasted. I mean, Castor was telling other reporters he could have me arrested for my stories. There were negative stories written about me in Philly Weekly and my coverage. So, I was on these TV talk shows and was getting slammed by them as well. But anyway, so it just started taking off. But the big difference was there was social media in October 2014, which didn't really exist in 2005.
Exactly.
There was no Twitter. Facebook was just for college students. And also, in the interim, these news organizations like Gawker and BuzzFeed and all these ones that weren't mainstream news outlets had sprung up. And they had no vested interest in protecting Bill Cosby like so many people in the media did. And they went after it with all they had. And when the first new accuser came forward in November, that's what kind of really started off the coverage again, because these other women started coming forward because CNN was covering it. And then, then these new accusers started coming forward who had never talked before. And that kind of forced the mainstream media to start covering it because there's that infamous video where Cosby's doing an interview with him and his wife with the AP, and they held on to it for 2 weeks. And he says, and they asked him about the sexual assault stuff. And he wouldn't answer it. He says, no, you're not going to use that, right? I would think the AP would know better than to use this interview and release this part of the interview, right? And he goes to his spokesman and said, call so-and-so in LA and see what you can do about this. And so they held on to it for 2 weeks before they finally released it.
I always felt that what was brilliant about Hannibal Buress's shtick was that at the moment that he said what he said, his topic was that Cosby has no business lecturing people on morality, which is what Bill liked to do. He liked to, he liked to say, kind of inhabiting his position as America's dad, that Black people have to lead, morally good lives and be known for this and not, not act up, not use bad language. And Hannibal just says, well, you a rapist, that's his response to Bill Cosby, that Cosby has no standing,
Yeah, and it did seem to open a floodgate. I remember prominent show business people like Tina Fey were immediately, oh yeah, Cosby, yes.
This was an open secret in Hollywood for years that he'd been doing this. In fact, after this case exploded again in 2014, Quincy Jones, who of course did the music for the Cosby Show, sent a text to one of the accusers who come forward that said, "I've been telling Bill for years to stop drugging women." And right. I mean, and I heard just in
Bill, you really shouldn't do that. I mean, yeah, I think you should stop it. It's a bad habit, please.
Yeah.
Well, just in, I think it was January this year. It's all a blur because of the pandemic. Joe Rogan and Bill Maher was on Joe Rogan's show, and they were both like, "Oh yeah, we've known about this for years. I've known since '84. How about you?" "Well, I've known since about '94 that he was doing this." And I'm sitting there going, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." At least
Sure.
Quincy Jones tried to stop him.
Well, it was when I was working at the Inquirer, it was common knowledge and one of the least kept secrets in Philadelphia journalism. I mean, we all knew about it, but we all sort of thought, well, maybe it won't. And I'm talking about early 2000s now. We thought, well, maybe it'll never come to trial. There's so much money involved in popularity involved, and he's such a huge figure.
Wait, you guys knew about him drugging and sexually assaulting women?
We didn't know about, the way that he did it, but it was sort of generally known. I mean, yeah, we didn't know.
Cheating on his wife, or about him?
Oh, I think so. Yes, I think so.
But I'm talking about drugging and sexually assaulting women.
No, we didn't know about the means. We did not know about the means, but just generally we knew he was not a faithful husband. Let's just put it that
right.
way.
Well, because
let's just put it that way, Nicole. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, there's a big difference between having affairs and drugging and raping women.
That's right.
And in Hollywood, they knew about, and in law enforcement, a lot of them, in the media, not Philly media, I mean, they knew about that he was drugging women again without their consent and then raping them.
Right.
So that's a big difference in having affairs. I think, when the whole Autumn Jackson thing happened after his son Ennis died in 97, that came out that it was she or was she not his daughter. I mean,
yes.
that was the first public thing we got that he even cheated on his wife, because he was writing all these books on fatherhood. He had the squeaky clean public image, the Cosby Show. And I was a huge fan when this whole story broke in January 2005. In fact, my initial reaction after it broke on Channel 10 was, and my boss assigned it to me, was not the cause. And I was just blown away. I couldn't even conceive that he could do something like this. But as I always say, like, your job as a journalist, which seems to be a lost art these days, is to set your personal feelings aside and try to find out the truth or try to find out the facts. And that's, the more I dug into it and the more I found out about the woman who was accusing him, and the more, it became more and more credible to me.
We'll talk more with Nikki in a moment. But first, this soothing musical Innertube from your friend, and I certainly hope mine, John Timpane.
Chasing Cosby has also been made into a remarkably compelling 6-part podcast produced by the Los Angeles Times and starring Nikki. You can hear the voices of the people who feature in Nikki's book. You can find the books at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and best of all, your local bookstore, and the podcast at Apple, iHeart, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Nikki is also co-author with Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn of Victim F, which tells the true story of a case that goes wrong and how the law can sometimes further victimize the victim. Learn more at Nikki's website, which is NicoleWeisenseeEgan.com. That's NicoleWeisenseeEgan.com. And she's got a great Twitter feed at N.Weisensee-Egan, WEISENSEEEGAN. And now back to Nikki, John, and Don at the musical Innertube.
He groomed these women. He would promise them guest shots. He would have dinner with their families. He came across as America's dad, trying to mentor them. And then at some point it just took a turn, and he drugged them and raped them. It just seemed a very strange situation, but that grooming thing was a very big part of his whole approach.
It was. And he didn't, as you said, he didn't just groom them, he groomed their families. And for the most part, he sought out these women to mentor them. There were these modeling agencies that were feeding him a steady supply of women. These women didn't go to him and say, for the most part, like Lili Bernard went to an open casting call, and that's how she got that Mrs. Minifield role later on. That's how she met Cosby. But for the most part, a lot of them, he called their agents, and their agent said, I want to mentor so-and-so, and their agents called them. Some were models. There were 2 modeling agencies that were just feeding him a steady supply of victims, one of which was sending them to him while he was filming The Cosby Show in Queens, New York for the entire time. So, teen models. And people forget, like, most of these victims, a lot of his victims were teenagers or barely out of their teens when this happened to them. So there's a little bit of the R. Kelly thing going on there, too.
Yeah. How did Andrea Costin get the chutzpah to actually bring it to court and do something about it?
Well, after it happened to her, and he had just been her mentor for 18 months. I mean, he's like 10 years older than her own father, and she's gay. Like, she wasn't in the least bit interested in him. I mean, she still called him Mr. Cosby, for God's sake. When she testified, that's how she called him. After it happened, she, like so many victims, was in shock for a while, but she went home she was switching careers, and she was having nightmares about women being raped, and it was by him, and it was her fault because she hadn't come forward. And her parents would hear she was waking up screaming from these nightmares. And finally, in January 2004, she woke up from yet another nightmare and was sobbing. And she called her mom, who was on her way to work, and she just blurted it out. And she told her mom what Cosby had done. Her mom nearly drove off the road. But and so, let me call you back when I get to work. And anyway, that's what set it off. And thank God her mom believed her. Like, some of these women, and that's what a lot of sexual assault victims do. They test it out first with someone they know to see what their response is, because especially when it's an icon like Cosby and someone it just isn't conceivable. Like, and your memory's gone. That's what the drugs do. They take away a lot of your memory, and they take away your ability to resist or even move. So that affects a lot of the decisions on whether to come forward. And then, of course, if they're like a Bill Cosby, America's dad, who would think he would do something like that? So there's this total disconnect.
And I think maybe going back to that grooming, if you're a woman, you come to your parents who had Cosby had made dinner for them and had mentored them to say that he raped it. That would inject that little bit of unbelievability to it, I guess.
Right. He insulated himself that way. I mean, that's why they groomed the parents. I mean, the first woman there was only one other victim who testified at the first trial, and her mom testified too. And this was a woman, the victim was a woman who worked for Cosby's agent at William Morris. And he was the most important client they had. She said, like, he had his own private line to call his agent just for Bill Cosby. That's how big a deal he was at William Morris. And she was his agent's assistant, and he did it to her. And her mother testified that she did try to tell her, and she's like, she didn't want to hear it, the mom. And she was crying on the stand because she felt so bad. So, it's hard for women to come forward in general, but then when you go to your mom and your mom doesn't believe you or doesn't want to hear it, you're done.
Mm-hmm. I also listened to some of the podcasts that you did on this, and you had some of the victims talking on the podcast, and it occurred to me a number of those women would start out talking about how they met Cosby, and it was sort of an everyday conversation, and then they were in tears by the time they talked about the rape. So even then, it was a pleasant memory of Cosby that just went downhill really fast.
Well, and what happened is, like, after he did this to them, then he set out to destroy their careers. There's not a one of them that then went on to have this illustrious TV. And so many of them were such talented singers or actresses. Like Lili Bernard is an incredible actress. I remember watching that role that she was a guest star. And I remembered it from watching it, The Cosby Show. And I write about this in the book. I didn't know she was his victim. There were so many victims coming forward. But when I was writing the book, or my book proposal, I was watching the All Red documentary. It was on Netflix, and they had a part about the Cosby stuff. And then I saw the role that Lili played. I'm like, oh my God, that was her. And after, I was horrified, because until that point, I could still separate it. The Cosby Show was still on TV1, even though it got taken off everywhere else after the scandal exploded again. And I could still separate it because it was one of my favorite shows growing up. But after that, I couldn't. I was just like, I'd always be looking in the background going, was she a victim? was she, because Jennifer Thompson, who was Jane Doe number 2 in Andrea's civil lawsuit, she has you can see her, and I think it's Theo's graduation, you can see her like walking to her locker. So some of them just got these extra roles where they're not speaking, but they're in the background. A lot of them did. And after that, he was just done with them.
I was re-listening to the podcast Chasing Cosby, and I was reflecting about how ironic the title of the 6th and final episode is, that no one is above the law, because, well, now Bill Cosby is out, and of course we see a national scandal about certain people who will not be named, who seem to be very culpable in a lot of different ways, including of subverting justice and democracy. But it seems as though if you've got money, you can get almost out of anything. You know, if you have notoriety and money together, that's almost an impregnable fortress.
It is. And, thank God there was a jury that, he couldn't reach for the second trial. But I couldn't, the surprising thing is that he ever got arrested or charged at all. I really was very skeptical that it was going to happen, but I got a tip in the form of a text that it was happening the next day. And I wrote into the night and broke the story the next day, that it was happening. It was surreal though, but they had to get it in before the end of the year because they weren't sure about exact dates at that point in January 2004 when it had happened. And they just didn't want to have any chance that he could get this thrown out for being beyond the statute of limitations. But it was to answer your original question, it was the only case and still is that is within the statute of limitations for sexual assault. So that's
what is the limit on that? On claims of sexual assault?
Well, this was aggravated in Pennsylvania. It was aggravated indecent assault, so it was 12 years.
I see.
So, but the DA can still appeal. I mean, it's not over yet, I don't think. So
you talked about how when you went on talk shows and after the book came out and that sort of thing, that you got pilloried for being anti-Cosby and that sort of thing. While you were doing your investigation, while you were coming up with the material for your reports in the book, were you running into stone walls?
Not as much, because I only had 2 months to write the book. Nothing about this case has ever been easy, I will just say, because I thought about doing a book in 2005 and I ended up taking a buyout from the Daily News. I started writing for People. John, you probably remember that, one of the many, we lost 25 people. The Inquirer was going to lose 100. And I was just so tired of living, worried about being laid off. And then, of course,
John was a victim of one of the later ones, I think.
That's right.
That's right. It happened to be at People in 2017, the re-engineering, as they call it. Thankfully, I got a year's severance and it allowed me to have the time to write the book. But I first thought about it back then, but the agent I was dealing with, it was a husband and wife team, and the wife wasn't that interested in it because she didn't want to dispel the Huxtable myth from the Cosby Show. And then I was just like, you know what? No one's ever going to publish this. I saw I was getting calls nearly every day from his attorneys threatening to sue us. My editors were getting letters from threatening to sue us. And it worked with a lot of media organizations. And in fact, Marty Singer was the one calling me. And he later did an interview that said his whole strategy is he doesn't want to file defamation lawsuits because they're hard to win and you don't get much money. So his whole strategy is to kill stories before they ever run. He had done the same thing with the National Enquirer. They were going to publish a story from another woman saying he'd done this to them. And instead, they traded it for an exclusive interview with Cosby. And Cosby had the right to review the story before it ran. And they agreed to for 2 years, not write any negative stories about him involving women and sexually assaulting them or affairs. And that agreement was renewable each year. But then in exchange, he'd have to give them 2 interviews. So, that's the type of power he has over the media too.
I just want people to know that among many other remarkable things about you, Nikki, that you did an entire master's degree course at Temple while you were working at the newspaper, that you did, I think, a master's in criminal justice. Am I correct?
Yes, because I'd started out covering politics. And then when I moved to Philly, they started throwing me into a lot of crime and it was awful. I mean, the stories are so tough to do. And I was just like, I want to make sense out of the senseless. And they briefly reinstated, but can you believe this ever happened? Tuition reimbursement. those were the days, right?
Yes.
And so I was like, okay, it has to be job related. So that's when I decided to go for it at Temple. And Yeah, and they ended that program, I think, when I was 3 classes short, but it all worked out.
Well, that's one of the great things about you, though, that you're not just a person who's quote unquote interested in crime or quote unquote interested in the law. You've pursued it so that you're an expert, that you know what you're talking about, that you're in a firmer position than many of the people really who have to report on this.
Yeah, well, that's how I am. I want to understand something. And because, like I said, I pursued it to try to make sense out of the senseless. And, what I ended up finding out is that there's no simple solutions to crime problems. I mean, it's a people issue. You hear all this, oh, it's a gun crime. Well, people are holding those guns, and there's deep issues, and it's very complicated. And it's just very simplistic to think that you can do things like that and solve crimes. And that's a lot of what I learned, and it was really helpful. I mean, but I'd seen it myself in some of the neighborhoods. It's very hard to overcome everything that you're dealing with in a neighborhood where a lot of, single parent homes. And they said, that used to be a situation where there were the old heads on the blocks who would sort of mentor the young guys who didn't have father figures. But, a lot of them left the area for like the suburbs, and the people who became old heads are the local drug dealers, and they're looking and going, so I can make $10 an hour working at McDonald's, or I can just go work for that guy in the corner and make, a lot more money.
Yeah, so, I wish I could say that's only a Philly story, right? But
it's not. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Nikki, I want to thank you for being on the musical Innertube. This is a story that probably isn't over yet. Even if Cosby never goes back to jail, there's going to be people writing about it for years.
Right. I mean, there very easily could be a third trial. God help us all. God. I know. I mean, I've covered both of them. It's not something that I'm eager to go through again. However, the ramifications of that decision for other cases is very troubling. And that's why I think they have to do something, because, I don't know how it's okay for a DA to say he violated the law and cut this secret deal. And it could pave the way for other people to get out of prison the same way. I mean, there's no proof of it. There's zero proof of it. The lower court's judges said, you're not credible. We don't believe you. And the higher court said, yeah, but he's Bill Cosby. So yeah, we would believe you.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Nikki. It's been just fantastic. We knew it would be. Thank you for being on the Musical Innertube.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Hey,
all the best,
thanks, Nikki.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
You can get in touch with us by email. We're at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
You can follow us on Twitter at @MInnertube, capitalize the M and I.
Our webpage is musicalinnertube, that's musical spelled with 2 A's, .libsyn spelled LIBSYN.com.
The Innertube is available on Amazon Music, Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.